December 7th, 1941, Pensacola Air Station, Florida, 7:55 hours. The sound reached the mess hall before the words did, a burst of static, then a clipped voice over the base radio. "This is not a drill. Pearl Harbor has been attacked." Coffee cups froze mid-air. Chairs scraped. The war had begun. Thousands of miles away, but for Gregory Boyington, it might as well have been next door. He stood by the window, 30 years old, a US Marine Corps aviator with a reputation for insubordination and a flask in his flight jacket. His uniform was crumpled, his jaw shadowed from a night that hadn't quite ended. The others ran for the hangar, but Boyington didn't move. He muttered, half to himself, "Now they'll need me after all." He wasn't wrong. Boyington had graduated from the University of Washington in 1934, joined the Marine Corps Reserve, and earned his wings 2 years later. But discipline had never fit him. He'd fought superiors almost as often as the flight stick, late reports, bar fights, reckless flying. By 1941, he'd been grounded more times than he'd been decorated. His record was a mess of contradictions. A brilliant pilot with no patience for command, a natural tactician who ignored orders. At 08:30 that morning, the base commander gathered the pilots. "Gentlemen, we are now at war," he said. Boyington's hand went up. "Does that mean I get my wings back?" The room went quiet. The colonel's stare could have cracked glass. "You're on probation, Captain," he replied. "Try not to start a war inside this one." Boyington smirked, saluted lazily, and walked out. Outside, the hangar doors were open. The air smelled of oil, salt, and tension. On the flight line, the stub-nosed trainers gleamed under the rising sun. He touched the fuselage of an F4F Wildcat like it was a handshake. He wasn't thinking about revenge or honor, just flight. The war had given him one thing the Corps never could, a second chance to be useful. That night, he wrote in his notebook, "The Marines don't want a drunk. The sky doesn't care." Within weeks, he submitted his resignation and vanished from the roster. Officially, it was misconduct. Unofficially, it was a transfer of allegiance. In early 1942, he boarded a freighter bound for Burma. His destination, the American volunteer group, the Flying Tigers. He left behind his uniform, his salary, and his reputation. What he kept were his reflexes, his stubbornness, and a growing sense that rules were for men who planned to survive. Boyington would later say he never believed in destiny, just timing. And on that December morning, his timing finally aligned with history. He wasn't the Marine they wanted. He was the one the war would remember. May 17th, 1942, Kunming Airfield, Yunnan Province, China, 0610 hours. The sun rose over the ridges of the Hengduan Mountains, turning the mist into a golden haze that hung low across the field. Curtiss P-40 Warhawks lined the dirt runway, their shark-toothed noses streaked with mud and oil. Engines coughed, mechanics shouted in 3 languages, and the scent of aviation fuel mixed with wood smoke from the nearby village. Gregory Pappy Boyington stood beside his plane, helmet tucked under his arm, a cigarette hanging from his lip. He was older than most of the men here, 30 by his own count, though his face looked older. The others called him Pappy, half in respect, half in jest. He didn't mind. He liked being underestimated. He joined the American volunteer group, better known as the Flying Tigers, just 4 months earlier, after walking away from the Marine Corps with nothing but his flight log and a letter of discharge. The AVG operated under Chinese command, paid by the mission, $500 for every confirmed kill. It wasn't patriotism that drew him, it was purpose and the promise of the sky. By May 1942, the war in China was collapsing into chaos. Japanese bombers struck supply lines daily, airfields were dust and canvas, mechanics scavenged parts from wrecks. The Flying Tigers were outnumbered 10-1. Every sortie was survival mathematics, fuel, distance, altitude, and luck. At 0625, the air raid alarm screamed across the valley. 30 Mitsubishi Ki-21 bombers were inbound from Hanoi, with 0 escorts high above them. Boyington climbed into his P-40, snapped the straps tight, and shouted through the radio, "Let's go earn the rent." The engine roared, and the squadron lifted into the morning haze. The Tigers climbed to 15,000 feet, sunlight blinding off the river below. Through the canopy, Boyington spotted the bombers, a black column moving north, neat as parade formation. He keyed the radio once. "I see them. Don't wait for orders." He rolled into a dive, engine howling, guns armed. The first burst tore through a bomber's wing, sending it spiraling into the clouds. He pulled up sharply, a Zero flashing past so close he saw the pilot's goggles. He turned, fired, missed. The next burst hit cleanly. Flame trailed across the sky. The fight lasted 9 minutes. When it ended, 3 bombers and 2 fighters fell to Boyington's guns. He returned to base with 20 rounds left and fuel barely above fumes. As he climbed out of the cockpit, a Chinese mechanic grinned and held up 5 fingers. Boyington lit a cigarette, exhaled and said, "Call it 4.5. That evening, the squadron gathered in the mess tent, drinking rice liquor from metal cups. Boyington told stories that made them laugh. How he'd once flown through a storm to make curfew. How a Zero's wing had missed him by an inch. Someone asked how he stayed calm. He tapped his temple. "You fly. Numbers, not nerves." By summer, his record stood at 6 confirmed victories in just over 20 sorties. The press called the Flying Tigers mercenaries. The men called themselves survivors. Every pilot here was one mistake away from being forgotten. Boyington wrote home once during that period. The letter was brief, neat, almost formal. "The pay is good, the odds are bad, but at least I'm flying." When the AVG disbanded in July 1942, most men went home heroes. Boyington didn't. He re-enlisted in the Marine Corps, this time with a reputation that couldn't be ignored. His file described him as reckless but effective. Commanders frowned. Combat needed both. He boarded a transport bound for the South Pacific on August 14, 1943. The ship rolled through grey seas, carrying him towards the Solomons, where a new kind of war waited. One of jungles, coral airstrips, and endless rain. He looked out over the waves and said quietly to no one, "The Tigers taught me one thing. You can't tame a war. You just ride it." He was heading for the squadron that history would never forget. VMF 214. The Black Sheep. September 14th, 1943. Espiritu Santo Airfield, New Hebrides. 5:45 hours. The first light broke through the palms, orange over steel-grey clouds. The runway was half mud, half coral dust. F4U Corsairs stood in uneven lines, their blue paint chipped, wings folded like sleeping birds. To the men stationed there, this wasn't paradise. It was the edge of the world. The smell of salt, sweat and gasoline never left the air. Gregory Pappy Boyington arrived the previous week, carrying nothing but a duffel bag, a flight log and a bad reputation. He was back in uniform, technically re-accepted by the Marine Corps. His record from China followed him, 6 confirmed kills, multiple disciplinary charges, and a note scrawled by a colonel. Brilliant in combat, impossible in peacetime. The command assigned him to organise a new squadron, VMF 214. It was a dumping ground, a collection of replacement pilots, washouts and transfers from other units, men who couldn't follow orders or had nowhere else to go. When Boyington looked over the roster, he grinned. "Black Sheep," he said. "Perfect name." Their Corsairs were the newest machines in the theatre, fast, unforgiving, prone to stalling during takeoff. The men called them ensign killers. Boyington loved them instantly. "A plane that fights you back," he said. "That's how you know it's alive." For weeks he drilled them mercilessly. Gunnery patterns, climb angles, combat rolls. He shouted through the radio like a drill sergeant with wings. "Don't fly straight, zig, roll, think. You're not machines, you're hunters." He rewrote formation tactics, forced his men to improvise. "We're not Marines," he said once. "We're wolves with better engines." The first mission came on September 23, 1943. Japanese bombers were approaching the Russell Islands, escorted by Zeros. Boyington led 20 Corsairs off the ground at dawn. He didn't bother with speeches, just one line. "Let's go spoil their morning." At 10,000 feet they sighted the formation. He climbed higher, dove hard and opened fire. His guns tore through a Zero's engine before it could react. Another came at him from below. He rolled, inverted, fired blind and saw it explode. The fight was chaos, blue and silver streaks twisting over the sea. When it ended, the Black Sheep had shot down 12 enemy aircraft. None were lost. Back at base, the men cheered, shouting over the engines. Someone painted a sheep's head on the side of Boyington's Corsair, grinning under a halo. He didn't smile. He walked to his tent, poured whiskey into a tin cup, and stared at the sea. In the following weeks, VMF 214 became legend. Between September and December 1943, they destroyed 94 enemy aircraft in 84 days, the highest kill rate in the South Pacific. The press called them heroes. Boyington called them lucky bastards. He personally claimed 26 confirmed kills, tying Eddie Rickenbacker's record from the First World War. Discipline barely held. The men gambled, fought, drank, and flew better than anyone else. When a general demanded stricter control, Boyington replied, "You want results or respectability?" Headquarters chose results. By Christmas, the squadron had earned 2 presidential unit citations. Reporters arrived, writing about Pappy's black sheep. One asked him for a quote. He said, "We're just the guys they didn't want." But behind the swagger, exhaustion was setting in. Every mission meant fewer faces in the mess tent. The weather grew worse, the skies more crowded with flak and zeros. In December, Boyington was promoted to major, though he joked that the Marines only wanted him to crash with rank. On January 2nd, 1944, he received orders for a large sweep near Rabaul, deep into enemy territory. Before takeoff, he told his men, "You've all got debts to collect. Don't make me write your names in the wrong column." He climbed into his Corsair, checked the gauges, and gave a small, crooked grin. The next morning he was gone. Witnesses later said his plane was last seen trailing smoke over the sea, 2 zeros behind him, still firing. His parachute opened once, then nothing. For the Black Sheep Squadron, the war went on. For their commander, it had just ended, somewhere between cloud and fire. Officially, Major Gregory Boyington was listed as missing in action. Unofficially, he was becoming a legend. January 3rd, 1944. Off the coast of Rabaul, Papua New Guinea. 06:10 hours. The air was already thick with heat and exhaust when Major Gregory Pappy Boyington climbed into his F4U Corsair. The mechanics had been awake since before dawn, patching holes, tightening bolts, fueling the birds for another day of impossible odds. The Black Sheep Squadron had been running on adrenaline and black coffee for weeks. Nobody said it aloud, but they all knew the math. Each new sortie was a coin toss with death. Boyington pulled his straps tight, the metal buckles clinking against the harness. He glanced at the kill marks painted under his cockpit. 25 black silhouettes. The 26th space was blank, waiting. He had slept 3 hours in the past 2 days, his eyes bloodshot, but his voice steady. "All right," he told the ground chief. "Let's go wake them up." At 06:15, 18 Corsairs lifted off from Bougainville, the engines roaring low and uneven like growling animals. Their target? A large formation of Japanese fighters gathering over Rabaul. Intelligence estimated 60 enemy planes. Most pilots would have turned back at those odds. Boyington saw opportunity. "That's 60 ways to make history," he said into the mic. The Pacific spread beneath them like polished steel. Clouds hung low and still. The smell of oil and gunpowder filled every cockpit. At 06:42, radar picked them up, a wall of zeros advancing out of the sun. The squadron tightened formation. Boyington's voice came over the radio, calm and clipped. "Don't think, just shoot first." The first pass was chaos. Contrails, tracer fire, black bursts of smoke. Boyington dived through the formation, guns blazing, tearing through one zero, then another. His wingman, Lieutenant Kinsey, saw 2 planes go down in flames. "He's got 27, someone shouted. Boyington didn't answer. He was already banking into another climb. At 06:53, 2 zeros locked onto his tail. He rolled hard left, pulling 7 Gs, the world narrowing into grey. One burst clipped his right wing, another smashed into the engine cowling. Warning lights flashed. The propeller sputtered. He tried to climb, but the engine seized. "Mayday, this is Pappy, I'm hit." It was the last transmission anyone heard. His Corsair began losing altitude fast, smoke pouring from the nose. Witnesses later said he managed to level out just long enough to bail. The parachute deployed, a white bloom against black smoke. For a few seconds he drifted over the Pacific, silent except for the hum of engines fading overhead. A Japanese patrol boat spotted him at 0702. He was pulled from the water, bleeding from his scalp and shoulder, pistol still in its holster. The soldiers tied his hands and radioed the nearest base. The war for Boyington didn't end, it simply changed coordinates. Back at Espiritu Santo, his men waited for word. The squadron returned at noon, short one plane. Lieutenant Harper filed the report. Major G.J. Boyington, last seen entering Cloudbank under heavy pursuit, presumed lost. The Marines listed him as missing in action. The Black Sheep Squadron held an unofficial wake that night. No speeches, no prayers. They passed a bottle of rum around the tent. One of the younger pilots asked, "You think he made it?" The oldest among them shook his head. If anyone did, it'd be him. For the next 20 months, the Pacific knew nothing of Boyington's fate. Rumours spread. Some said he'd been captured, others that he'd crashed into the jungle. Time magazine printed his obituary. Medals were prepared, then shelved. But in a prison cell half a world away, a bruised and skeletal man scratched a date into the wall with a piece of wire. January 3rd, 1944. He would live that day over, again and again, for the next 600 nights. January 3rd, 1944. Rabaul Roads, New Britain, 0712 hours. The sea slapped the wooden hull in a slow, indifferent rhythm, salt dried on his lips. A strip of canvas tied his wrists. When the patrol boat turned toward Simpson Harbour, Gregory, Pappy, Boyington, kept his eyes on the horizon and counted the seconds between engine surges. He had always measured survival in numbers. Now the math was stripped to its bones. They dragged him onto the pier at Rabaul and walked him past the black mouths of anti-aircraft guns that had killed so many of his friends. A clerk wrote his name incorrectly, then crossed it out with a hard line. The first questions came fast. Unit, aircraft, strength of forces at Bougainville. He lied once, then stopped. They already knew most of it. He learned to answer like a broken radio, short, static, nothing useful. For 2 weeks he lived in a room that smelled of kerosene and damp rope. The daily ration was a bowl of rice the size of his fist and a cup of hot water that tasted of rust. He slept on a plank. When he could not sleep, he memorized the sound of the harbour. Barges at 02 o'clock, trucks at 0430, cranes whining just after dawn. He marked time with the slow bloom of mould on the ceiling. On January 17th, a guard told him he would be sent north. No destination, just a direction. They shipped him under a tattered awning on a coastal freighter. The hold stank of diesel and fear. He counted 63 prisoners in that space, American, Australian, Dutch. He learned the rule that kept men alive. Trade silence for water, patience for a corner of shade. On January 22nd, they anchored at Truck Lagoon. No one spoke as the blue water slid by like polished glass. A corporal from Brisbane coughed blood into his hands. Boyington tore a strip from his shirt and bound the man's mouth, because there were no other bandages to give. By early February, he reached Afuna, the interrogation centre outside Yokohama. There were no Red Cross visits here, no mail, no numbers on a camp register. Prisoners were not POWs, they were detainees. It was a place of questions and demonstration. The guards worked with routine precision, slaps open-handed so they left no cuts, kicks practiced to bruise the kidneys without breaking the skin. Food came in metal bowls, a ladle of millet, a smear of watery miso, sometimes a handful of barley. He learned to shake the bowl twice to make the grain settle. It bought him 5 more mouthfuls a day. The room was 8 paces long and 5 paces across. He paced it each morning, 8 by 5, as if walking the perimeter could turn walls into air. When newcomers arrived, a Navy radio man dragged in at 0240, a B-24 gunner at 0415. He whispered practical things. Hide a sliver of soap in your belt stitch. Keep your toenails cut to avoid trench rot. Count your breaths to slow the shakes. He cut his speech down to ration size. Words used energy. Energy spent life. They shaved his head on March 3rd. He had weighed 190 pounds when he flew out of Bougainville. By March 30th, he estimated 140. Numbers made it real, and being real meant he still existed. In the yard, thin sunlight drifted across crushed gravel. He met a runner from Torrance, California, a quiet man with the 1,000-yard stare of distance races. They spoke in code the guards could not chart: lap times, wind, how to breathe through lactic fire. It was the only conversation that felt like air. On May 8th, they transferred him across the bay to Amori, a sandbar-turned-prison in Tokyo Bay, a camp of bamboo barracks and winter wind. Here, at least, prisoners had numbers and letters carved into planks above their bunks. The routine was simple and ruthless. Wake at 0500, roll call at 0515, work until 1800, hauling coal, dredging mud, carrying timbers. A guard with a whistle measured the day in shrill, exact fragments. Boyington's hands split at the knuckles, then scarred over, then split again. There were beatings, and there was the thing worse than beatings: indifference. He learned the choreography of avoidance: eyes down, back straight, hands visible, no sudden movements. He learned the economy of dignity: offer help only when you can lift without trembling, speak only if it steadies someone else. At night, he lay on a straw mat that crawled with lice and tried to remember the feel of a Corsair's stick in his palm. He forced himself to rehearse gunnery solutions in the dark. 20-degree deflection, 250 yards, 2-second burst. He would not let the numbers leave. Spring turned to summer, and summer to cold again. In December 1944, a new batch of prisoners arrived after a hellship run that took 23 days. Men came off the gangway with the slow motion of starvation. Boyington gave up half his barley to a Marine sergeant from Pennsylvania who could not stand. 2 days, he said, then you can walk. The man walked on the 3rd day. It felt like an airstrike had been called off. He learned to read the city by sound. At 2200, factory whistles. At 0130, switch engines clanking in the yards. At 0205, the far thunder of heavy bombers when the weather broke. In May 1945, firestorms rolled across Tokyo. From the yard, they watched orange light smear the clouds and listened to the crackle of a city being burned to its grid. Ash drifted even to the island. Some men cried. Boyington did not. He stared at the glow and imagined tracer lines bending toward targets at 400 miles per hour. Habit is another kind of hunger. By July, the camp ration slipped to 700 to 800 calories a day. Men's cheekbones turned angular as aircraft wings, their eyes too large for their faces. Beriberi swelled ankles to the size of fists, then subsided, then swelled again. Dysentery traced a wet map across the latrine trench. He caught a fever on July 18th and lost 2 days to dreams in which the Pacific lifted him again, white parachute snapping above, the water clean and indifferent and honest. He woke to a medic pressing a cup to his lips and a voice saying, "Slow." He swallowed in sips like a pilot feathering a dying engine. The last questions ended in August. On the 6th, guards stood clustered at the gate and spoke in tones the prisoners had not heard before. Uncertainty. On the 9th it happened again. After the 15th, the compound changed shape. The blows stopped. The shouting fell to a murmur. A truck did not arrive that morning. No orders were issued. A guard placed a bucket of rice on the ground and stepped back. The men stared at it like it might be a trap. Then they ate, slowly, carefully, without speech. On August 29, 1945, American aircraft circled low over Tokyo Bay, white stars on blue wings, and dropped drums fitted with parachutes. The drums struck the water and bobbed against the pilings. Inside were tins of meat, chocolate, cigarettes, sulfur powder, and letters that smelled faintly of home. A pilot banked his C-47 and waggled his wings. A prisoner waved a rag. The plane dipped as if nodding. It was the most formal ceremony any of them needed. When the first US personnel set foot on Amori in early September, the men lined the path in silence. Some could not stand. Others stood at attention, though their knees shook. A captain in clean khaki moved down the row, reading names from a list. Major Gregory J. Boyington, he called. A lean man with a shaved head and a crooked mouth stepped forward and saluted with a hand that trembled. The captain stared, then smiled in relief that looked almost like grief. "Welcome back," he said. Boyington weighed approximately 110 pounds when he boarded the hospital ship in Tokyo Bay. He ate in measured spoons under a nurse's watch because too much food could stop a starved heart. He learned to sleep with lights on. He learned to walk without bracing himself against a wall. On September 12th, a corpsman placed a folded uniform on his bed, marine green, the cloth too heavy for a man rebuilt from bone. He touched the fabric like a relic and said nothing. News moved faster than his weight returned. Back home, men he had never met had argued over medals attached to a name the papers had already buried. They printed him alive. They printed him famous. They printed him simple, which he was not. On October 3rd, a doctor signed the discharge from the ship's ward. Before he left, a steward pressed a small, battered packet into his hand. The things recovered from a camp box labelled with a number instead of a name. A sliver of soap in waxed paper, a bent spoon, a strip of belt leather with 4 notches cut into it, and a sheet from a Japanese ledger with a date scrawled in pencil. January 3rd, 1944. He folded the paper once and slid it into his pocket. The date that had started the long night stayed with him because memory, like flight, required reference points. He had survived 20 months on discipline stripped of ceremony. The same discipline that sharpened a gun sight and timed a burst to 2 honest seconds. Now he would be asked to trade that discipline for parades, interviews, and speeches where crowds wanted courage to be clean. On the dock, a correspondent asked the first question he would hear 100 times. "Major, how did you endure it?" He looked past the man to the water, to the metal skin of a transport reflecting morning light, and answered in a voice that had learned to spare words. "I counted," he said, "and I waited for the next takeoff." September 29th, 1945, San Francisco, California, 14:40 hours. The ship slid through the fog into the bay, its deck lined with gaunt men in ill-fitting uniforms. Band music played somewhere beyond the haze, and flags snapped above the piers. For most of them, it was the first sound of peace they had heard in years. Gregory, Pappy, Boyington, stood at the rail, 40 pounds lighter, a row of healing scars along his ribs, watching the coastline he'd stopped believing in. The crowd on the pier shouted his name, cameras flashing, flashbulbs reflecting off the water. He didn't wave. He'd been photographed enough for one lifetime, mostly by enemies. A Marine major met him at the gangway, crisp salute, clipboard in hand. "Welcome home, sir. Washington wants you in D.C. for the Medal of Honor ceremony." Boyington nodded. "Tell Washington I need a drink first." The citation was formal. 26 confirmed victories, extraordinary heroism, leadership beyond duty. The ceremony itself, October 5th, 1945, at the White House, was brief. President Truman shook his hand and said, "You did a damn fine job, Major." Boyington replied, "Thank you, sir. Next time I'll try not to get caught." Laughter rippled through the room, but his eyes stayed flat. He returned to the Pacific for a speaking tour, visiting air bases that now smelled of new paint and optimism. The war was over, and the country wanted simple stories: courage, triumph, the good fight. Boyington had none to give. He drank too much, slept too little, and drifted between bases and hotel rooms. When asked what captivity had been like, he said, "Boring, but the food was consistent." By 1947, his marriage collapsed. By 1948, he'd resigned his commission again. He tried business, failed. Tried Hollywood, failed harder. The Black Sheep Squadron was reborn as a television myth 2 decades later. Clean uniforms, cheerful banter, adventure without trauma. He watched one episode in silence, then turned the set off. "They missed the point," he muttered. "It wasn't about glory. It was about staying alive long enough to light another cigarette." Still, he wrote it down. Every mistake, every bottle, every moment of rebellion. In his 1958 memoir, Black Sheep. The book was raw, unsentimental, and unflinching. It sold 500,000 copies. He spent the royalties paying debts and hospital bills. Fame never changed his opinion of himself. "I'm not a hero," he said in one interview. "Heroes die. I just ran out of luck slower than the rest." In the 1960s, he spoke to young Marine pilots preparing for Vietnam. His advice was concise, stripped of romance. "Keep your head. Know your numbers. don't believe in invincibility. One pilot asked if he'd do it all again. Every damn second, Boyington answered, but this time I'd quit drinking after the first medal. By the 1980s, his lungs were gone from years of smoke and exhaustion. He moved to Fresno, where the morning smelled of jet fuel from the nearby base. He kept a radio by his bed tuned to the control tower frequency, listening to call signs rise and fade through static. On January 11th, 1988, Gregory Pappy Boyington died at age 75. No speeches, no brass band. Just a Marine colour guard, a folded flag, and the sound of jets overhead performing the missing man formation. He left behind a record of contradictions. 26 victories, 20 months as a prisoner, and one life lived entirely against regulation. Historians called him reckless. His pilots called him the only man who made them believe chaos could win. The Marine Corps eventually called him what he had been all along: irreplaceable. In the end, the numbers tell less than the silence that followed him. He had spent a lifetime fighting 2 wars, one in the sky, one inside himself, and managed, somehow, to survive both just long enough to see their cost. And when the final logbook closed, the entry might as well have read, "Still flying, still defiant."